He had expected a black-edged letter, a discreet notice from a country solicitor informing him that the inconvenience had been resolved. He had expected the quiet closing of a ledger, the final payment for a service rendered, the neat and tidy conclusion to a distasteful bargain. He had not expected a duchess caked in mud, with ink on her fingers and a ledger in her hands. He had not expected a son he had all but forgotten, healthy and whole and clinging to her skirts. He had not expected to return to the tomb he had chosen for her and find that she had, against all odds, resurrected it, and in doing so, had begun the slow, agonizing process of resurrecting him. The solicitor's office smelled of dry paper and drier promises. Dust motes danced like frantic sprites in the single beam of watery sunlight that pierced the grimy window pane, illuminating the worn patches on the turkey carpet. It was a room built for the discreet execution of wills and the quiet ruin of men. Alastair, Duke of Blackwood, felt the chill of the place settle not on his skin, but deeper in the hollowed-out space where his soul used to reside. He viewed the proceedings with the same detached interest he might afford the shoeing of a horse or the purchase of a new carriage, a tedious necessity, a transaction to be concluded with minimal fuss. Across the mahogany desk, she sat, Alara Vance. Her name was a whisper, a thing of no consequence. She was a collection of disadvantages, a walking list of societal failings. An orphan, penniless, and most damningly sickly. A persistent, rattling cough was her constant companion, a sound that seemed to Alastair to be the very percussion of impending death. It was, in fact, the primary qualification for the role he was now bestowing upon her. He needed a wife who would die, quietly, discreetly, and far away from London. He needed a duchess to hold the title for a short, finite time, satisfying the bizarre clause in his grandfather's will that required him to marry before his 30th birthday or forfeit the larger part of his unentailed assets. Assets he desperately needed to fund his political machinations, the real war he waged daily in the hallowed, snake-filled halls of Parliament. She was pale, a watercolor painting left out in the rain, her features blurred by illness and poverty. Her dress, a drab gray thing, was meticulously clean but hopelessly worn, the fabric thin enough to show the sharp angles of her collarbones. Her hands, long and slender, were clasped tightly in her lap, the knuckles white. Only her eyes held any color, a startling, lucid green that seemed entirely at odds with the frailty of her form. They were not the eyes of a dying woman. They were the eyes of a cornered animal, sharp with an intelligence that made Alastair momentarily uneasy. Beside her, her uncle, a man whose desperation was a palpable stench of stale sweat and cheaper gin, vibrated with a greasy eagerness. He did all the talking, his voice a low, conspiratorial drone that detailed his niece's virtues, her quiet nature, her lack of demands, her unfortunate but, in this case, convenient fragility. Alastair did not listen. He had already read the physician's report. 6 months, a year at most. The damp, unforgiving air of the north would surely expedite the matter. The settlement is generous, Your Grace, the uncle, Silas, was saying, his eyes flicking towards the papers on the solicitor's desk. And Alara understands her duties. Alastair's gaze met hers over the expanse of polished wood. He expected to see gratitude, fear, perhaps even a flicker of pathetic hope. He saw none of it. He saw only a cool, unnerving assessment. It was as if she were the one purchasing the horse, and she was not entirely convinced of its soundness. Her duty, Alastair said, his voice a low rasp, and used for anything but commands and dismissals for so long it had forgotten other tones, is to retire to Blackwood Manor, and to remain there. The unspoken words hung in the dusty air between them, and to die there. A dry, hacking cough shook her thin frame. She pressed a handkerchief to her lips, and when she pulled it away, Alastair did not need to see the telltale crimson to know it was there. It was a part of the contract. Her uncle placed a proprietary hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be comforting but looked more like a man steadying a valuable, albeit damaged, piece of cargo. "She will be no trouble, Your Grace," Silas assured him. Quiet as a mouse. Alistair rose, the scrape of his chair a definitive sound in the quiet room. The business was concluded. He had acquired a temporary duchess. A placeholder. He felt nothing. No pity for the girl, no disgust for her uncle, no guilt for the cold-blooded nature of the arrangement. He felt only the familiar, gnawing impatience to be gone, to return to the real world of power and consequence, leaving this sordid little play to its inevitable, tragic conclusion. He signed the documents with a flourish of black ink, his signature a stark, angular cage. He was caging her. He was caging the title. He was caging a part of his life he wanted sealed off and forgotten. The solicitor, a man whose face was a mask of professional neutrality, slid the marriage license toward her. Ilara picked up the pen. Her hand did not tremble. She signed her name, Ilara Vance, in a script that was surprisingly firm and clear. Then she paused, looked at the solicitor, and asked, her voice quiet but clear, "And now? And now you are the Duchess of Blackwood," the solicitor stated, as if announcing the time. Ilara's gaze flicked to Alistair. A flicker of something, irony, perhaps, or a deep, weary cynicism that matched his own, crossed her face. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of submission. It was an acknowledgement of a fact, as one might acknowledge the falling of rain or the setting of the sun. The transaction was complete. He turned and walked out of the room without a backward glance. He did not offer her his arm. He did not speak a word of farewell to her uncle. He was the Duke of Blackwood, and he had a war to fight. This pale, coughing girl was merely a piece of necessary collateral. He consigned her to the north, to the damp and the decay, with the same thoughtless pragmatism with which he would consign a damaged cannon to the scrap heap. The journey north was a study in silence. It stretched for 3 days, a purgatory of rumbling wheels and the ceaseless, drumming patter of rain against the carriage roof. Alistair had insisted on traveling with her to Blackwood Manor, not out of any sense of propriety, but to ensure the finality of the act. He needed to see her delivered to her tomb, to turn the key in the lock himself, metaphorically speaking, before he could fully turn his mind back to the intricate games of Westminster. Ilara sat opposite him, a small, still figure wrapped in a thick traveling cloak he had ordered for her, a practical purchase devoid of sentiment. For hours on end, she would simply stare out the window, her expression unreadable as the lush, green landscapes of the south gave way to the harsher, more desolate beauty of the northern moors. The world outside the carriage seemed to bleed of color, becoming a wash of gray skies, brown heather, and the black skeletal shapes of wind-blasted trees. The air grew colder, the dampness seeping through the very walls of the carriage, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and decay. Alistair read. He had brought with him a stack of government reports, agricultural surveys, and political treatises, his armor against the suffocating intimacy of the carriage. He hid behind the crackling pages, the dense blocks of text a fortress against the silent accusation of her presence. He did not want to think about her. He did not want to acknowledge the soft, persistent rasp of her breathing or the occasional, stifled cough that she tried to hide in the folds of her cloak. Each sound was a reminder of the bargain, a confirmation of the living, breathing person he was deliberately, methodically consigning to oblivion. He did not expect conversation. He did not want it. Yet, on the second day, as the carriage jolted over a particularly rutted stretch of road, she spoke. "Does it have a library?" Her voice, though quiet, cut through the rumbling monotony. Alistair looked up from his report, startled. He had almost managed to forget she was there. "Does what have a library?" he asked, his tone clipped. "Blackwood Manor," she clarified, her gaze still fixed on the bleak landscape. "I'm fond of reading." The simple, practical question was so unexpected it momentarily disarmed him. He had anticipated pleas or tears or recriminations, not inquiry about books. "Yes," he said, after a moment's thought. "It has a library." A large 1 inch, he remembered it from his childhood. A vast, two-story room filled with the scent of old paper and leather, a place his father had loved and he had avoided. It would be cold now, he imagined, and damp. The books would be furred with mildew. Good, she said, and that was all. She retreated back into her silence, leaving Alistair with a strange, unsettling feeling. He had expected a victim. He was beginning to suspect he had acquired something far more complicated. On the final day, they left the main road and turned onto a private track. The trees, ancient oaks and elms, pressed in on either side, their branches overgrown and tangled, forming a dark, dripping canopy that blocked out what little light the gray sky offered. The air grew thick with the smell of leaf mold and stagnant water. They passed a gatehouse, its windows boarded up, its stone crumbling. One of the massive iron gates had been torn from its hinges and lay rusting in a ditch, half swallowed by weeds. This was his estate, his inheritance, a place he had not seen in 15 years, a place he associated only with loss and the cold finality of his parents' death. He felt a grim satisfaction at its state of decay. It suited his mood. It suited the purpose for which he was now using it. The carriage finally broke through the tunnel of trees and drew to a halt on a sweeping, gravel drive that was more weed than gravel. Before them stood Blackwood Manor. It was not a house. It was a carcass, a vast, Gothic monstrosity of blackened stone, its face pockmarked with darkened windows like vacant eyes. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, crawled over the walls, choking the life from the stone, its tendrils creeping over the sills and around the mullions as if trying to drag the whole structure back into the earth. A section of the roof over the west wing had collapsed, leaving a jagged, gaping hole open to the weeping sky. The whole edifice seemed to slump, to sag under the weight of its own neglect and the oppressive, silent judgment of the moors. It was a rotting tooth in the jaw of the landscape. Alistair felt the grimness of it settle over him, a familiar shroud. This was the right place, a place to be forgotten, a place to die. He stepped out of the carriage, the cold, misty rain instantly soaking the shoulders of his greatcoat. The air was heavy with the smell of wet stone and something else, something acrid and unpleasant like cold, long-dead ash. The front door creaked open, and a woman stood silhouetted in the cavernous, dark hall. She was tall and severe, dressed in black bombazine that seemed to absorb what little light there was. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. She had been old when he was a boy. Now she looked ancient, petrified. Her face was a mask of disapproval. "Your Grace," she said, her voice the sound of grinding stones. Her eyes flicked past him to the woman, now descending carefully from the carriage. She took in Alara's pale face, her slight frame, her worn clothes. A flicker of something, contemptuous pity, perhaps, crossed the housekeeper's features. Alara stood on the drive, her worn boots sinking slightly into the muddy gravel. She did not look at the housekeeper. She did not look at Alistair. Her gaze was fixed on the house. She tilted her head back, her eyes traveling over the crumbling facade, the broken roof, the grasping ivy. The rain began to fall harder, plastering strands of dark hair to her pale cheeks. She looked so small, so fragile against the backdrop of that monstrous, decaying pile. For a fleeting, unwelcome moment, Alistair felt a pang of something that might have been guilt. He crushed it instantly. This was a necessity. He turned to her, his duty done. He had delivered her. Now he could leave. "Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms," he stated. It was not an offer. It was an order. "I trust you will be comfortable." The lie was so blatant it was almost a cruelty. Alara finally lowered her gaze from the house and met his. The rain dripped from her chin. The lucid green of her eyes was startling in the gray gloom. She did not shiver, though the cold was a physical thing, a presence between them. "You are leaving," she said. It was not a question. "I have matters to attend to in London," he replied, his voice flat. "Of course," she said, and a small, bitter smile touched her lips. The war. He did not know if she meant the war in Parliament or the one that was so obviously etched onto his own soul, and he did not care to ask. He gave a curt nod, a final dismissal. He turned his back on her, on the house, on the entire sordid arrangement, and moved to climb back into the carriage. He did not look back. He did not want to see her standing there alone in the rain, a fragile ghost about to be swallowed by a tomb of his own making. He wanted only the rumble of the wheels carrying him away, the clean, sharp scent of city coal smoke, the hard realities of politics that were so much easier to face than the soft, persistent rasp of a dying woman's breath. He had abandoned her. The engine of his life, fueled by duty and ambition, required such sacrifices. He settled into the carriage, pulled the door shut, and did not permit himself to feel a single thing. For 3 days, Alara did not leave the room they had given her. It was not a bedroom. It was a sarcophagus, a vast, cold chamber in the supposedly habitable East Wing, furnished with massive, shroud-draped furniture that loomed like granite monuments in the perpetual twilight. A single, tall window looked out not onto the moors, but onto a suffocating internal courtyard, a lightless well of slick, green-black stone where the rain fell with a miserable, endless patter. The dampness was a living entity in the room. It beaded on the walls, bloomed in dark, spidery patches on the ceiling, and infused the very mattress with a bone-deep chill that no number of blankets could warm. The air tasted of mildew and sorrow. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, tended to her with a grim, resentful efficiency. She brought trays of thin gruel, weak tea, and stale bread, placing them on a bedside table with a thud of finality. She did not speak. Her presence was a constant, silent judgment. She was the high priestess of this decaying temple, and Alara was an unwelcome, temporary sacrifice. The housekeeper, the house itself, the very air, it all seemed to be waiting for her to fulfill her part of the bargain. They were waiting for her to die. And for 3 days, Alara obliged them. The journey, the cold, the profound, crushing weight of her abandonment had leached the last of her strength. Her cough returned with a vengeance, a deep, tearing thing that left her breathless and trembling. She lay in the great cold bed, the damp sheets clinging to her like a winding cloth, and felt her will to fight begin to fray. The house was winning. It was actively working against her, its chills seeping into her lungs, its silence pressing in on her, its despair becoming her own. She drifted in a feverish haze, the world reduced to the patter of rain, the ticking of a distant clock, and the looming, disapproving presence of Mrs. Gable. She was a powerless survivor in a hostile world, and this world was designed to be her last. On the 4th morning, something shifted. Alara awoke not to the familiar gray gloom, but to a strange, milky light. The rain had stopped. In the unaccustomed silence, she could hear a bird singing, a small, defiant thread of sound in the oppressive quiet. She pushed herself up on her elbows, her body aching, her breath a painful rasp. She looked around the room, at the funereal furniture, the damp-stained wallpaper, the single, pathetic fire hissing in the grate, producing more smoke than heat. She thought of the Duke, Alistair, his cold eyes, the finality with which he had turned his back on her. He had brought her here to be erased. A white-hot clarity pierced the fog of her illness. It was a fury so pure and so potent it felt like a jolt of life itself. She would not. She would not die in this cold, wet box to make his life more convenient. She would not fade away like a character in a maudlin novel. She had been bought and sold, traded for a title and a tomb, but the one thing she still owned was the stubborn, tenacious spark of her own life, and she would not let them extinguish it. She stopped being a dying woman. She started being a living one. When Mrs. Gable entered with the morning gruel, she found Alara out of bed, wrapped in a blanket, standing by the window. "You should not be up," the housekeeper stated, her voice flat. "You will catch your death." "I believe that was the general intention," Alara replied, her voice rough from disuse and coughing. "It seems a bit redundant to worry about it now. This room is uninhabitable. I am moving." Mrs. Gable's thin eyebrows rose. "His Grace instructed that you were to be housed in this wing." "His Grace is in London, fighting his wars," Alara said, turning from the window to face the woman. She met the housekeeper's cold gaze without flinching. "I am the Duchess of Blackwood, and I am here. This house is now my war. And my first command is this: I will not sleep in a crypt. Find me a smaller room, a drier one with a window that faces the sun, if such a thing exists in this godforsaken place." The housekeeper stared, for a moment, nonplussed. She had expected a meek, fading girl. She was confronted with a duchess, however pale and frail, issuing orders. For a long, silent moment, a battle of wills was fought in the cold, damp air. Then, with a barely perceptible sniff of disapproval, Mrs. Gable gave a stiff nod. "As you wish, Your Grace." It was the first victory. A small one, but it was a beginning. The new room was in a different, long-neglected part of the house. It was small, dusty, and crammed with furniture, but it was on the south side. Its windows, once cleaned of a decade's worth of grime, looked out over what had once been a vast, terrace garden, now a wilderness of weeds and thorns, but beyond it lay the rolling, sun-drenched moors. Most importantly, it was dry. A fire, properly laid in the small, efficient fireplace, actually produced warmth. This small, dry room became her fortress, her command center. From here, Alara began her campaign. She did not start with the grand, ruined staterooms or the collapsed West Wing. She started with the practical. She started with survival. Wrapped in a shawl, she ventured out of her room, exploring the labyrinthine corridors of manor. The scale of the neglect was staggering. Entire wings were surrendered to the damp and the dark, the air thick with the smell of rot and the scurrying of unseen things. Furniture worth a king's ransom was decaying under ghostly shrouds. Tapestries bled their color onto the walls in damp, mournful streaks. She found the kitchens. They were a vast, cavernous space, but at their heart was a massive hearth and a series of smaller, more modern iron ranges, all thick with rust and grease. A skeleton staff of 2 skivvies and a cook, a woman as sour and ancient as Mrs. Gable, moved like ghosts in the gloom. The larder was nearly bare. The estate, she learned, was buying in meager, poor-quality supplies from the local village at exorbitant prices. This was insanity. A great estate with hundreds of acres of land, buying its own food. Her next stop was the library. It was as the Duke had described, a magnificent 2-story chamber, but a dying one. A fine, greenish-gray fur of mildew coated the spines of countless books. The air was a miasma of damp paper and decaying leather. But in a small, glass-fronted cabinet, she found what she was looking for, the estate ledgers dating back 50 years. She had them brought to her small, warm room. For a week, she did nothing but sit by the fire, a blanket over her knees, and read. She was not a stranger to accounts. Her own father, before his ruin, had been a merchant, and he had believed a woman should be able to balance a book as well as she could manage a house. Slowly, painstakingly, she unraveled the story of Blackwood's decline. It was a tale of apathy and incompetence, of funds diverted, of lands left fallow, of tenants ignored, of assets dwindling to almost nothing. The estate was bleeding money, hemorrhaging it from 1,000 small, neglected wounds. The Duke, in his London fastness, was pouring a fortune into its maintenance, but the money was simply vanishing into the morass of decay and mismanagement. Armed with this knowledge, Alara began to issue orders. They were practical, logical, and utterly ruthless. Board up the West Wing and the North, all of them. We will not heat them. We will not clean them. We will let them rot. We live here, she declared to a stunned Mrs. Gable, gesturing to the small section of the house she had claimed. The rest is a museum of failure. We are closing it. She summoned the groundsman, a man named Croft. He was a gnarled, weathered man with hands like oak roots and quiet, intelligent eyes. He had expected another London fool. He listened, his expression dubious at first, as she spoke. She did not talk of aesthetics. She did not talk of restoring the formal gardens. The south terraces, she said, pointing from her window. The soil is good. They get the sun. I want them cleared. All of it. I want a kitchen garden. Potatoes, cabbages, onions, carrots. Things that grow. Things we can eat. That's a year's work for 10 men, Your Grace, he said, not with insolence, but with weary pragmatism. Then we will start with what 2 men can do in a month, she countered. And I will pay you a bonus, out of my own accounts. For every acre you reclaim, she had an allowance, a generous one stipulated in the marriage contract. The Duke had intended it for fripperies, for silks and jewels to distract a dying woman. She would use it to buy seeds and shovels. Croft looked at her, at this frail duchess with ink on her fingers and fire in her eyes. He saw the ledgers on her table. He saw the practicality in her plans. And for the first time in a decade, a flicker of something other than resignation entered his expression. "Aye, Your Grace," he said, a slow smile cracking the leather of his face. "We can do that." He became her first ally. His loyalty, and that of the few gardeners and stable hands who remained, shifted decisively from the absent Duke to the present Duchess. They saw her walking the grounds, her cloak muddy, conferring with Croft over drainage ditches. They saw her in the kitchens, her sleeves rolled up, directing the maids in a massive cleaning of the ranges, her knowledge of lye and grease surprising them all. She found a still room, long abandoned, and set the younger maids to gathering herbs from the overgrown gardens. Rosemary, thyme, lavender, drying them in the newly warm kitchens, filling the air with scents of life instead of decay. One afternoon, exploring the abandoned nursery wing, a place so silent it felt sacred, she heard a sound. A small, scratching noise from behind the door of a locked room. Mrs. Gable had told her the wing was empty, used for storage. A cold dread, a suspicion she hadn't dared to form, prickled Alara's skin. "Mr. Croft," she called, her voice sharp. "Bring me a crowbar." The door was forced. The room inside was small, little more than a closet, with a single, grimy window high in the wall. It contained a small cot, a bucket, and a child. He was small for his age, perhaps 5 or 6, with a tangle of dark hair, so like the Duke's it stole her breath. He was dressed in rags and shrank back into the corner, his eyes wide and dark with a fear that looked ancient and profound. He was thin but not starved. Someone had been feeding him, leaving trays outside the door, in the same way one might feed a dog. He was the Duke's son, Arthur, the product of a first marriage, a detail no one had seen fit to mention. A ghost, forgotten and locked away like one of the estate's decaying treasures. Alara's fury, the cold, clear anger that had saved her, now blazed into a white-hot inferno. She looked at this small, feral creature, this abandoned boy, and saw a mirror of her own abandonment. She knelt down, ignoring the filth on the floor. "Hello," she said softly. Her voice did not tremble. "My name is Alara. I am not going to hurt you." The boy just stared, silent and watchful as a wild thing. That evening, she confronted Mrs. Gable. The housekeeper stood ramrod straight, her face a stony mask. "He is the Duke's son," Alara stated, her voice dangerously quiet. "The first Duchess she left," Mrs. Gable said, her lips thin. The boy was a reminder. His Grace gave instructions that he was to be kept quiet. Out of sight. Out of sight. You locked a child in a room. He was fed. He was kept safe. He was kept like an animal in a cage. Alara shot back, her control finally snapping. "From this moment on, you will not go near him. You will not speak to him. He is my son now. Do you understand me? I am his mother. She wasn't, not by blood, not by law, but in that moment she claimed him with a ferocity that was absolute. She had the nursery cleaned. She moved her own belongings into the adjoining governess's suite. She bathed the boy herself, cutting through the grime to find a pale, thin child with his father's wide shoulders and a lost, haunted look in his eyes. He did not speak. For weeks, he remained utterly silent, following her with his eyes, watching her every move. She did not press him. She simply included him. He sat by the fire while she worked on the ledgers. He followed her to the kitchens, where the cook, won over by the new abundance of fresh vegetables and Alara's praise for her long-forgotten skill with pastry, would slip him warm tarts. He trailed behind her and Croft in the gardens, watching as the earth was turned, as green shoots began to appear. Slowly, the house began to breathe again. The scent of baking bread and rosemary replaced the smell of mildew. The south-facing rooms were filled with light and warmth. The small, reclaimed section of the manor became a hive of purposeful activity. Alara had sold off a decaying collection of carriages, using the money to repair the kitchen roof. She had leased a swath of unused grazing land to a local sheep farmer, generating the first real income the estate had seen in a decade. The house was no longer a tomb. It was a fortress. Her fortress. And inside its warm, well-defended heart, a silent boy was slowly, cautiously, beginning to trust that the woman with the ink-stained fingers and the quiet voice was not going to leave him. The house was fiercely alive, and it was hers. Alistair returned in the autumn, 6 months after he had left. He did not come seeking a home. He came seeking a grave. The session in Parliament had been brutal, a political evisceration that had left him stripped of his allies and his ambitions. He had poured his fortune and his soul into a bill that would have reformed the corrupt system of borough-mongering, and he had been systematically, ruthlessly destroyed for it. His party had betrayed him, his friends had abandoned him, and the cause to which he had dedicated his life was in ashes. He was hollowed out, exhausted to the very marrow of his bones. He traveled north not in a fine carriage, but on horseback, alone, pushing himself to the point of physical collapse. He wanted the punishment of the wind and the rain, the ache in his muscles, the stark, empty beauty of the moors. He wanted silence. He wanted the oblivion of the place he had chosen for his wife's demise. He assumed, with a distant, unemotional certainty, that he would find the business concluded. He expected to be met by a grim-faced Mrs. Gable, to be shown a neat new headstone in the crumbling family chapel, to feel nothing. The final closing of a distasteful account. He turned onto the private track leading to the manor, the familiar sense of oppressive gloom settling over him. But something was different. The overgrown branches that had formed a tunnel over the road had been cut back, allowing dappled sunlight to pierce the canopy. It was a small change, but jarring. Then he saw the gate. The massive iron gate that had lain rusting in a ditch for 15 years was gone. In its place stood a simple, sturdy, 5-barred wooden gate, freshly painted. It was closed. He had to dismount to open it. The act of it, so mundane and yet so unexpected, felt deeply strange. Someone was managing this place. As he rode up the final stretch of the drive, the full scope of the change hit him with the force of a physical blow. He reined in his horse, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a profound, disorienting shock. Smoke, not the pathetic wisp he had seen on his last visit, but thick, white plumes of it, rising from half a dozen chimneys on the south and east wings. The drive itself was clear of weeds, the gravel raked and level. The ivy had not been removed from the entire facade. That would be an impossible task, but it had been brutally hacked back from the windows of the main block, letting the glass glitter in the autumn sun. The collapsed roof on the west wing remained, a jagged scar, but the wing itself had been sealed. The windows were boarded over neatly and deliberately, as if that part of the house had been surgically amputated. It was not restored. It was contained, defended. It no longer looked like a carcass. It looked like a fortress, hunkered down for a siege. He dismounted, his legs unsteady. The great front door opened before he reached it. But it was not Mrs. Gable who stood there. It was a young maid with pink cheeks and a clean apron, who bobbed a quick, shy curtsy. "Your Grace," she murmured, her eyes wide. He stepped into the hall. The air did not smell of damp and decay. It smelled of beeswax and wood smoke and, faintly, of baking bread. The oppressive gloom was gone, replaced by a clean, echoing space. The floor was polished. The portraits on the walls were free of dust. It was still vast and intimidating, but it was no longer dead. "Where is Mrs. Gable?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "In her rooms, Your Grace," the maid answered. "The Duchess. Her Grace has her manage the linens now. The Duchess. Her Grace." The words hung in the clean air. He had come expecting a ghost and found a queen. "Where is she?" he demanded. "In the study, I believe, Your Grace." With the accounts. He knew the way. He strode through the now familiar corridors, his boots echoing on the polished floorboards. The changes were everywhere. Doors to entire wings were closed, sealed. The air grew warmer as he approached the south wing. He pushed open the door to the small study that had once been his mother's morning room. And there she was. The room was filled with sunlight. A fire crackled in the hearth. Shelves that had been empty were now filled with books, their spines cleaned, their leather oiled. And at a large desk, positioned to catch the light from the window, sat Alara. She was not the pale, wraith-like creature he had abandoned in the rain. Her hair, which she had worn in a severe, tight bun, was now loosely pinned, with soft tendrils escaping to frame a face that had gained a surprising measure of color. She was still slender, but she no longer looked fragile. She looked formidable. Her dress was simple, a practical dark wool, but the cuffs were stained with ink, and there was a smudge of what looked like dirt on her cheek. She was bent over a massive ledger, her brow furrowed in concentration. At her feet, sitting on a rug and building a lopsided tower of wooden blocks, was a small boy with a head of familiar, unruly dark hair. The sight of the child was a second, more powerful blow. It buckled something deep inside him. Arthur, his son, the boy he had ordered kept quiet, the memory he had locked away with all the other painful ghosts of this house. He looked healthy, clean. His clothes were patched, but sturdy. And as Alistair stood frozen in the doorway, the boy looked up, not at him, but at Alara, and said in a clear, small voice, "Is this one tall enough?" Alara did not look up from her ledger. "Almost, my love. 2 more." The quiet, domestic intimacy of the scene, the casual endearment, the peaceful focus. It was so utterly alien to everything he knew of this house and of his own life that he could not process it. He felt like an intruder, a ghost in his own home. He must have made a sound, a shifting of weight, a drawing of breath, because she finally looked up. Her lucid green eyes widened for a fraction of a second in surprise, and then narrowed, all warmth vanishing, replaced by a cool, guarded appraisal. The boy, sensing the change in her, scrambled to his feet and moved to stand half behind her chair, his small hand gripping the wool of her skirt. He peered at Alistair with wide, wary eyes. Alistair's throat was dry. He searched for something to say, for a way to assert his authority, to reclaim his space. All that came out was a blunt, stupid statement of fact. "You're alive." A ghost of her old, bitter smile touched Alara's lips. She did not rise. She did not show any deference. She sat there, in his house, at her desk, with his son clinging to her skirt, and looked at him as if he were a tradesman who had arrived at an inconvenient hour. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she replied, her voice as crisp and cool as the autumn air. "I have striven to overcome it." The battle lines were drawn in that moment. He was the Duke. This was his house, his title, his son. But the air in the room, the loyalty in the boy's eyes, the very warmth emanating from the fire, all belonged to her. He had returned to his ancestral home only to find that he was a stranger, an invader in a kingdom she had built from the ashes he had left behind. "What have you done to my house?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I stopped it from collapsing," she said simply, her gaze unwavering. "You were paying a fortune for the privilege of managed decay. I found it more economical to simply let the dead parts die and focus on keeping the living parts alive." She gestured vaguely towards the ledgers. "It's all in the accounts, should you care to inspect them. Though I warn you, they're a far more harrowing read than your political treatises." The sheer audacity of her, the cool, businesslike tone, infuriated him. He took a step into the room, his presence filling the space, his shadow falling across her desk. The boy, Arthur, flinched and pressed closer to her. Alistair's eyes fell on the child, and a fresh wave of something complex and bitter, guilt, resentment, confusion, washed over him. "He should not be here," Alistair said, the words tasting like poison. Alara's spine stiffened. A protective arm went around the boy's shoulders. Her voice, when she spoke, had lost its cool irony and was now edged with steel. He lives here. Where else should he be? Locked in a closet in the north wing? The direct hit silenced him. She knew. Of course she knew. She had found all the rot in this house, including the rot in his own soul. He started, but he had no defense. There were no words to excuse what he had done, the cold, deliberate act of forgetting his own child. That was the order of a man who mistakes cruelty for strength. She finished for him, her voice quiet but devastating. I have rescinded the order. He is the heir to this dukedom. He is being raised as such. He is learning his letters, his numbers, and how to tell a weed from a vegetable. He is a child, not a shameful secret. Alistair felt the foundations of his world, already fractured, begin to crumble. He had come here for silence and oblivion, a place to lick his wounds in peace. Instead, he had walked into a reckoning. This woman, this pale, dying creature he had bought and buried, had not only refused to die, she had thrived. She had taken his ruin and forged it into a home. She had taken his forgotten son and made him her own. She had taken his power, and he had no idea how to get it back. For days, they circled each other like wary predators. Alistair, accustomed to command, found his authority utterly neutered. The staff, from Mr. Croft down to the youngest maid, were polite, but their loyalty was transparently, unshakably hers. They looked to her for orders, for approval. When he issued a command, they would hesitate, their eyes flicking towards the Duchess for confirmation. He was the Duke in name, but she was the ruler in fact. He was an intruder in the rhythm she had established. He would come down for breakfast to find her already finished, her place cleared, the study door firmly shut. He wandered the sealed-off wings of the house, the silence and the cold of familiar comfort. But it was no longer the silence of neglect. It was the silence of a deliberate, managed quarantine. She had contained the decay. She had put his ghosts in their place. His presence was a disruption to the fragile peace she had built, particularly for Arthur. The boy, who was slowly blossoming under Alara's patient care, reverted to a silent, watchful shadow whenever Alistair entered a room. He would stop what he was doing, his small body tensing, and retreat to Alara's side. He never spoke to Alistair. He rarely even looked at him. To the child, Alistair was not a father. He was a threat, a large, loud, angry man who upset the woman who was the sun in his small universe. The realization was a constant, low-grade agony for Alistair. He saw the easy affection between Alara and the boy, the way she would absent-mindedly smooth his hair as she read, the way he would bring her a wildflower from the garden, a silent offering that she would accept with a small, genuine smile. He saw a bond he had no part in, a family that had formed not only without him, but in spite of him. The crisis, when it came, arrived on the back of a storm. It rolled in from the moors one evening, a mass of bruised, purple clouds that swallowed the sun and plunged the manor into an early twilight. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rattled the old window frames. Then the rain came, not the gentle patter Alara had grown accustomed to, but a violent, horizontal deluge, thrown against the house by gale-force winds. And then the thunder began. It was not the distant rumble of a summer storm. It was a physical assault, a deafening crack of sound that seemed to split the sky directly overhead, followed by a tremor that shook the very foundations of the ancient house. Alistair was in the library, a bottle of brandy and a book his only companions, when the first clap of thunder hit. He froze, the glass halfway to his lips. The sound was not just loud, it was concussive. It was the sound of cannon fire. It was the sound of the world ending on a muddy field in Spain. His heart began to pound, a frantic, trapped bird against his ribs. The sweat broke out on his brow, cold and slick. The smell of old paper and leather vanished, replaced by the acrid, metallic scent of gunpowder and blood. The library, with its ordered shelves and quiet shadows, dissolved around him. He was back there. The screams of men, the roar of the guns, the chaos, the terror, the noise, the endless, deafening noise. He didn't realize he had dropped the glass until he heard it shatter on the stone floor. He was on his feet, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He had to get out. He had to get away from the noise. He stumbled out of the library, into the corridor, but the thunder came again, a rolling artillery barrage that seemed to go on forever. The walls of the corridor seemed to press in on him. The portraits on the walls became the leering faces of the dead. He was losing control. The carefully constructed walls of his detachment, the cold armor of duty and cynicism he had worn for years, were shattering. He was drowning in the past, and he clawed his way through the house, searching for an escape, for silence, for an exit from the hell inside his own head. Alara was in the nursery with Arthur. The boy was terrified of the storm, his small face pale, his eyes huge. She had lit extra candles and was reading to him in a low, steady voice, her calm a small anchor in the roaring chaos of the weather. When the first great clap of thunder had shaken the house, Arthur had cried out and buried his face in her lap. "It's just noise, my love," she had murmured, stroking his hair. "It's just the sky making a fuss. It cannot get in. We're safe in here." Then she heard it, a crash from downstairs, a heavy, stumbling sound in the corridor. It was not the sound of the storm. It was the sound of a man. She told Arthur to stay put, to cover his ears if he was frightened, and she slipped out of the nursery, holding a single candle. The corridor was dark, the wind shrieking through some unseen crack. And then she saw him, the Duke. He was not the imposing, arrogant man who had confronted her in the study. He was a stranger. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes wide and vacant with a terror she could not comprehend. He was braced against the wall, as if it were the only thing holding him upright, his knuckles white. "Your Grace," she said, her voice sharp with alarm. Alistair, he didn't seem to hear her. He was muttering to himself, his words lost in the howl of the wind. Another crack of thunder, louder this time, lit the corridor in a ghastly, strobing flash of white. He flinched violently, crying out a raw, wounded sound, and pushed himself away from the wall, staggering towards the main staircase, as if to flee. He looked broken, utterly, terrifyingly broken. The invincible Duke of Blackwood, the cold, ruthless politician, was gone. In his place was a man drowning in a private horror. And in that moment, Alara felt not the satisfaction of a victor, but a sudden, piercing surge of something she could only name as compassion. Behind her, the nursery door creaked open. Arthur, unable to bear being alone, had followed her. He stood in the doorway, a tiny, robed figure, his face a mask of fear as he watched this strange, frightening man who was his father. Alistair reached the top of the grand staircase, his movements clumsy, uncoordinated. He seemed intent on leaving, on fleeing into the storm, into the night, anywhere to get away from the noise that was only in his head. He was abandoning them. He was leaving. Section, just as he put a hand on the newel post to begin his descent, Arthur's small, trembling voice cut through the roar of the storm. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice tight with a primal fear. "Please don't leave like Mama did." The words were barely audible, a tiny, desperate plea against the rage of the elements. But Alistair heard them. He heard every single word. He froze, his hand clenched on the polished wood of the newel post. The sound, the memory, the past, it all receded, pushed back by the devastating power of that small, whispered sentence. He turned, his movements slow, robotic. His wild, haunted eyes found the small figure of his son, standing in the flickering candlelight. "Please don't leave like Mama did." The sentence was a key, unlocking a room in his memory he had sealed shut for years. His first wife, Isabella, beautiful, vivacious, utterly unsuited for the cold solitude of Blackwood and the even colder solitude of his heart. She had hated it here. She had hated his long absences, his emotional distance. And one day, she had simply left, packed her bags, taken a carriage, and disappeared from his life, leaving behind a note and a 2-year-old son she could not bear to be burdened with. He had come home to find her gone, and in his grief and fury, he had turned his back on the child who was a constant, painful reminder of his failure. He had ordered him kept quiet. He had abandoned him, just as she had. And now, that same child was begging him not to do it again. The strength went out of Alistair's legs. The roar in his head subsided, replaced by a vast, echoing silence filled with the sound of his own shame. He slid down the wall, his back scraping against the wood paneling, and sat heavily on the floor, his head in his hands. He did not sob. He did not make a sound. He simply folded in on himself, a great, broken man, shattered by the innocent words of the son he had wronged so profoundly. Alara moved. She went first to Arthur, kneeling before him, her hands gentle on his shoulders. "Go back inside, little one," she said softly. "It's all right. I will take care of it." She steered the trembling boy back into the warmth and light of the nursery and firmly closed the door. Then she turned back to the Duke. He hadn't moved. He was a heap of darkness and misery in the corridor. The storm still raged outside, but inside, in the aftermath of his collapse, a strange quiet had fallen. She walked over to him, her candle casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She did not know what to do. She knew how to fight him. She knew how to defy him. She had no idea how to comfort him. So she did the only thing she could think of. She did what was practical. She sat down on the floor beside him, not too close, leaving a respectful distance between them. She set the candle on the floorboards, its small, steady flame a defiant beacon in the gloom. She did not touch him. She did not speak. She simply sat with him in the dark, a silent, steady presence, and waited for the storm, both outside and in, to pass. Hours passed. The storm slowly blew itself out, the thunder receding into a distant grumble, the rain softening to a steady, quiet drumming. In the corridor, the only sounds are the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall below and the ragged, slowly steadying rhythm of Alistair's breathing. He had not moved, had not lifted his head from his hands. Alara remained beside him, her own exhaustion a deep ache in her bones. She could have left him there. She could have returned to the warmth of the nursery, to the child who was now, in every way that mattered, hers. It would have been the sensible thing to do. But she stayed. Some instinct, some deeply buried and unwelcome empathy, held her there. She had seen the man behind the monster, the wound beneath the armor, and she could not, in good conscience, leave him to bleed out alone. Finally, in the deep, quiet hours before dawn, he stirred. He lifted his head slowly, as if it were a great weight. His face, in the guttering candlelight, was a wreck. The arrogant mask of the Duke was gone, leaving behind the pale, exhausted face of a man who had been to hell and back. His eyes, when they met hers, were stripped bare of all artifice. They were filled with a shame so profound it was painful to witness. "The war," he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "Sometimes, I'm still there." "The noise," he trailed off, unable to articulate the horror. Alara simply nodded. She had no experience of war, of cannon fire and dying men. But she understood being trapped. She understood fighting a battle that no one else could see. "The storm is over," she said quietly. It was a simple statement of fact, but it carried a deeper meaning. The immediate crisis was past. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw not the defiant adversary or the inconvenient wife, but the woman who had sat with him on a cold floor for hours, who had guarded his vulnerability, who had not used his moment of utter collapse against him. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough. "Why did you stay?" Alara considered the question. She could have given a practical answer, that she could not have him alarming the household or frightening the boy. But that was not the whole truth. "Because no one," she said, her gaze steady, "should have to face the dark alone." She stood up then, her joints stiff from the cold floor. She held out a hand to him. It was not a gesture of supplication or romance. It was a practical offer of support, an anchor. After a long moment of hesitation, he took it. His hand was large and cold, but his grip was surprisingly unsteady. She pulled, and he rose, staggering slightly to his feet. They stood there for a moment in the pre-dawn gloom, the silence between them no longer a weapon, but a shared space. It was a truce, unspoken, unnegotiated, but absolute. "Come," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You need tea." She led him not to his own grand, cold rooms, but to her small, warm fortress. The study was quiet, the fire banked to glowing embers. She left him standing uncertainly in the middle of the room and went through to the small adjoining kitchen she had established for herself and Arthur. He heard the clink of a kettle, the scrape of a match. Simple, domestic sounds that felt utterly alien in this house, and yet profoundly comforting. He looked around the room she had made her own. It was a reflection of her. Practical, ordered, but with touches of unexpected warmth. The ledgers were stacked neatly on the desk. A vase on the mantelpiece held a spray of autumn leaves and dried heather. Arthur's wooden blocks were piled in a basket by the fire. It was a room that was lived in. It was a home. She returned with 2 steaming mugs of tea. She handed one to him, her fingers brushing his. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of warmth through his cold skin. He took the mug, his hands wrapping around it, absorbing the heat. She did not sit behind her desk, her seat of power. She sat in the worn armchair opposite the one he sank into, creating a circle of shared warmth around the hearth. They drank their tea in silence. It was not the hostile, charged silence of their previous encounters. It was a quiet, restful space. The silence of 2 exhausted soldiers after a battle. "The accounts," he said finally, his voice still rough, breaking the quiet. "You said they were a harrowing read." It was an opening, a confession of his own failure. "They were," she confirmed, her tone neutral, not accusatory. "A story of neglect, but a story that can be rewritten." She looked at him over the rim of her mug. "The roof over the kitchens is repaired. We have enough vegetables stored to see us through the winter. And the tenants on the East Farms have agreed to pay their rents in exchange for repairs to their barns. The fund from the sheep lease will cover the cost." He listened, stunned. She spoke of his estate, his finances, with a calm, detailed authority that he, the Duke, had never possessed. He had simply thrown money at the problem from a distance. She had gotten down into the dirt and solved it. I did not know," he admitted. It was a confession of a different kind. A confession of ignorance, of willful apathy. "There was no reason you should," she said, and there was no sting in the words. "You were fighting a different war." A faint, wry smile touched her lips. "It seems we have both suffered a defeat." The shared admission of failure, of vulnerability, forged a new, tentative connection between them. He had been defeated in the grand, public theater of Parliament. She had been sentenced to death in a cold, private room. And yet here they were, both still standing, both survivors. "Arthur," he said, the name an unfamiliar weight on his tongue. "My son." "Yes," she said softly. "He is a good boy, quiet, but clever, and kind. He is afraid of me." It was a raw, painful admission. "He is afraid of loud noises and sudden movements, and men who look like they carry the weight of the world on their shoulders," she corrected gently. "He is afraid of being abandoned again. He doesn't know you. He only knows that the world is safer when you are not in it." The truth of it was a clean, sharp blade to the heart. Alistair looked down into his empty mug. He had built a life on a foundation of duty, power, and emotional detachment. He had believed it made him strong. Now, sitting in this quiet, warm room with this woman who had seen the very worst of him, he realized it had only left him utterly, profoundly alone. The truce solidified into a partnership in the days that followed. It began with a practical task. Alara was reviewing the plans Croft had drawn up for draining the waterlogged pasture down by the river, a project that would reclaim another 50 acres of valuable grazing land. The figures were complex, the engineering principles beyond her experience. She found Alistair in the library, not drinking, but staring out the window at the bleak, rain-swept moors. She hesitated in the doorway, then took a breath and entered. "I need your help," she said, without preamble. He turned, surprised. She laid the drawings and Croft's costings on the large library table. "This is your area of expertise, I believe. Agricultural surveys, land management." He looked at the papers, then at her. It was the first time she had asked him for anything. It was an offering, an invitation into her world, into the work of the estate. He came and stood beside her, looking down at the plans. He pointed to a section of the drawing. Croft's plan is sound, but he has not accounted for the spring melt from the fells. The culvert needs to be twice this size and reinforced here, or the first thaw will wash the whole thing away. His voice was low, authoritative, but it was the authority of knowledge, not of rank. She listened, her brow furrowed in concentration, as he explained the complex hydrodynamics, sketching a revised plan on a piece of scrap paper. They stood side by side, their heads bent over the table, their shoulders occasionally brushing. The air between them was charged not with animosity, but with a shared purpose. He was no longer the absent landlord. She was no longer the usurper. They were two intelligent people solving a problem. That afternoon, they walked the land together, with Croft, to inspect the site. Alistair, dressed not in fine London clothes, but in sturdy boots and a heavy coat, strode through the mud and wet grass, his long-forgotten knowledge of his own land returning to him. He spoke with Croft not as a duke to a servant, but as one expert to another. Alara watched them, a small, quiet figure wrapped in her cloak. She saw the respect in Croft's eyes as he listened to Alistair. She saw the focus, the engagement in Alistair's face. He was not the haunted man from the storm, nor the arrogant duke from her memory. He was a man connected to his land, a man with a purpose. They began to work together every day. She would bring him the ledgers, and he would help her decipher the labyrinthine legalities of old tenant contracts. He would bring her reports on new crop rotations, and she would ground his grand theories in the practical realities of their budget and manpower. They argued, they debated, but their disagreements were about strategy, not power. They were partners. The study became their shared office, the two large armchairs by the fire their debriefing space at the end of each day. And slowly, tentatively, Alistair began to build a bridge to his son. He did not force it. He followed Alara's unspoken lead. He started by simply being present, a quiet, non-threatening figure in the background. He would sit in the study while Alara gave Arthur his reading lesson, not interrupting, just listening to the sound of his son's small, hesitant voice. One day, Arthur dropped his pencil, and it rolled under the large desk. Before Alara could move, Alistair was on his hands and knees, retrieving it. He held it out to the boy. Arthur hesitated, his eyes flicking to Alara, who gave a small, encouraging nod. The boy took the pencil, his small fingers brushing Alistair's. "Thank you," he whispered, the first words he had ever spoken directly to his father. The victory was small, but it felt more significant to Alistair than any political triumph. He started leaving small gifts for the boy to find, a curiously shaped stone from the riverbank, a bird's feather, a small, intricately carved wooden horse he had whittled by the fire in the evenings. He never presented them directly. He would simply leave them on the mantelpiece or by Arthur's place at the breakfast table. They were silent offerings, apologies, and invitations in one. The winter closed in, blanketing the moors in snow and isolating the manor completely. But inside, the fortress Alara had built was warm and bright. The scent of pine from the Yule decorations she and Arthur had gathered mingled with the familiar smells of baking and wood smoke. The house was no longer a tomb, but a sanctuary, a home. One evening, a week before Christmas, the three of them were in the study. A blizzard was raging outside, but the fire was roaring. Alara was reading, Alistair was reviewing farm yields, and Arthur was asleep on the hearthrug, his head pillowed on the flank of an old, gentle wolfhound that had attached itself to the boy. The scene was one of utter domestic peace, a peace Alistair had never known. He looked at Alara, her face soft in the firelight, her brow furrowed in concentration over her book. He looked at his son, sleeping peacefully, his face untroubled. He felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost took his breath away. It was not ambition. It was not duty. It was not lust. It was a quiet, profound, and terrifying sense of belonging. This was his home. These were his people. He had come here to bury a wife and had instead found a life. The call of the old world arrived on a bitter morning in late January. The snow had finally ceased, and a rider, half frozen and exhausted, had managed to get through. He was a royal courier, his uniform stained and travel-worn, and he carried a dispatch sealed with the king's own crest. The arrival of such a messenger at the frozen, forgotten northern estate caused a stir throughout the household. It was a trumpet blast from a world they had all but forgotten. The courier presented the dispatch to Alistair in the main hall. The staff watched from a discreet distance, their faces a mixture of awe and apprehension. Alara stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting on the smooth, cold wood of the balustrade. Arthur stood beside her, his small hand clutching hers. She watched Alistair take the heavy vellum envelope, her expression carefully neutral, but inside, her carefully constructed fortress was beginning to crumble. She had known this peace was temporary, an interlude, an anomaly. He was the Duke of Blackwood, a major political player, a man of power and consequence. He could not remain buried in the north forever, balancing ledgers and planning drainage ditches. His world was London, the world of kings and ministers, of power and intrigue. She and Arthur in this reclaimed house were a footnote in his life, a convalescence. The war he was truly meant to fight was calling him back. Her defenses, the ones she had so painfully, cautiously lowered, began to slide back into place. The cool, cynical pragmatism that had ensured her survival returned, a familiar, bitter taste in her mouth. She immediately assumed he would leave. Of course he would leave. It was his duty. It was his life. She had been a fool to imagine anything else. Alistair broke the royal seal, his face unreadable. He scanned the contents of the letter, his expression hardening, the familiar mask of the cold, detached duke settling back over his features. Alara's heart sank. She recognized that look. It was the face of the man who had abandoned her in the rain. He looked up, his gaze sweeping past the courier, past the anxious staff, and finding her at the top of the stairs. For a long, silent moment, their eyes locked. She braced herself for the inevitable, for the cool, dismissive announcement of his departure. She straightened her spine, preparing to be the Duchess of Blackwood, the competent chatelaine who would manage his estate in his absence. The partner, not the wife. Never the wife. He said nothing. He simply turned and walked, the dispatch in his hand, towards the study. He did not invite her to follow, but she did. She released Arthur's hand, murmuring for him to go to the kitchen for some milk and honey, and followed Alistair down the corridor. She felt the cold seeping back in her bones. She found him standing before the fire in their shared office. He was staring into the flames, the king's letter held loosely in his hand. "Your king summons you," she said, her voice formal, clipped. She was putting distance between them, rebuilding the walls he was about to make necessary. "The political winds have shifted, I presume. Your enemies are weakened. Your allies have need of you." "They have," he confirmed, his voice flat. He did not turn to look at her. "A crisis in the cabinet. They offer me my old position. More than that, a chance to push through the reform bill. Everything I worked for." "Then you must go," she said. The words were like stones in her mouth. "Your duty calls." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I've spent my entire life," he said slowly, his voice low and contemplative, "in service to that duty, to the crown, to the idea of England. I sacrificed everything for it. My first marriage, my son, my own soul. I thought it was a noble sacrifice. I thought I was building something important." He turned then, and the look on his face was not the cold mask of the Duke. It was the raw, vulnerable face of the man she had sat with on the floor during the storm. "But I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with a dawning, revolutionary understanding. "I was not building. I was demolishing. I was tearing down my own life, brick by brick, in the service of an idea. You are the one who has been building. Here, in this house, with my son." He took a step towards her. "My duty is not in London. My duty is not to a king who uses men like me as pawns in his games. My duty," he faltered, his eyes searching hers, filled with a desperate, hopeful plea. My duty is to the home that was built from my own ruins. Alara stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not dare to believe him. It was a trick, a kindness before the blow. As if sensing her disbelief, he turned back to the fire, and with a sudden, decisive movement, he tossed the king's dispatch into the heart of the flames. The vellum blackened, curled, and was consumed by the fire, the royal seal melting like a drop of blood before vanishing into ash. The symbolic act was so shocking, so final, it stole her breath. He had not just rejected an order. He had rejected his entire world, his past, his ambition. He turned back to her, his face illuminated by the fire that had just consumed his old life. "I am not leaving," he said, his voice resonant with a certainty that shook her to her core. "I am home." He closed the distance between them, stopping just before her. He did not touch her. He simply looked at her, his gaze intense, stripping away the last of her defenses. "Alara," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "I was sent a duchess who was meant to die. Instead, I was given a woman who taught me how to live. I did not know what a home was until I saw the one you built. I did not know what a father was until I saw you be a mother to my son. I do not want the world. I do not want power. I want this. I want the winters and the ledgers and the arguments over drainage ditches. I want the quiet evenings by this fire." He reached out then, his hand gently, hesitantly, cupping her cheek. His touch was warm, grounding. "You are my home." The dam broke. The carefully constructed walls of her cynicism, her pragmatism, her fear, they all came crashing down, washed away by a flood of emotion, so overwhelming she thought it might break her. A single tear, hot and unexpected, escaped and traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or of fear, but of profound, earth-shattering relief. She did not reply with words. She couldn't. Instead, she leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement that was a complete and total surrender. It was an acceptance, a confession that she wanted this too, that she, who had never had a home, had found one here with him. He gathered her into his arms, his embrace not one of passion, but of profound, desperate gratitude. He held her as if she were the single anchor in his storm-tossed life. Alara, who had stood alone against the world for so long, finally allowed herself to lean on someone else. She rested her head against his chest, hearing the strong, steady beat of his heart, a rhythm that matched her own. Outside, the wind howled, and the first flakes of a new snow began to fall, promising to once again seal them off from the world. But inside the study, in the warm glow of the fire, two survivors, a broken duke and a pragmatic duchess, held each other close. They were no longer just partners in survival. They were a family, a permanent fixture against the coming winter, in the heart of a house that was, like them, fiercely alive and completely whole.